Hi, this is Elwin Robertson, founder of High Energy Academy, and I'm here today with Daniel Vitalis, founder of Survival, finderspring.com, as well as numerous other wonderful projects serving mankind. And I want to get Daniel's perspective today because I realised how deeply and intrinsically he'd influenced some of what I've been sharing with you, and I thought, let's go to the source, let's go to the man himself who's got that perspective on why so many of us are depleted in energy and why so many of us are struggling to just even keep up with the pace of modern life. So thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Yeah, I'm really happy to, Owen. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. So yeah, do you mind starting off just explaining, Daniel, what it is from your perspective that has led to us being in such an energy depleted state that, say, 98% of people are addicted to stimulants, not just for occasional ritual use as they may have been before, but even just to get through the day, or
just to whip the horse along, right? I think, and it's really core to my whole philosophy, and I think what informs a lot of my teaching, and I want to pick it apart enough so that it doesn't come across as being too cliche for people, because I think it sounds a little cliche to say, well, because we're not living a very natural lifestyle. But the depth and breadth of that is so extreme now that we've gone in 10,000 years. Now, well, that would be the generally accepted amongst scientists. That's the reference date, about 10,000 years from being hunter-gatherers, which means we were essentially as wild. We were still tool makers. We were still fire stewards. But we were essentially as wild as any creature in the wild today. And in 10,000 years, we've gone to the space age, to the nuclear age, through and to the other side of the industrial age. And we've come to a world now where people spend so little time interacting with the natural world that they've lost the ability to tell the difference between a manicured nature and actual nature. And I mean that we take a walk in the park and we think, okay, this park is a preserved piece of wild land, when in reality, usually that park was constructed. A great case in point would be Central Park in New York, which appears to be a place in the city that never got built on, but actually was built there. It's like a sandbox. So we've come to this world now where we don't even have the ability to perceive nature anymore, and we spend very little time in it. We spend over 95% of our time indoors. We spend most of our time in contact with artifacts. And what I mean by artifact, I think this is an important piece, because we have this word artificial. I could say, well, we live in a very artificial world. What does that mean? Well, an artifact is an item that bears the imprints of man's will upon it. So you could say the difference between a stone and a stone arrowhead. The stone wouldn't be an artifact. That would be a natural item. The artifact would have been carved by man, shaped by his will into that arrowhead. Well, now we interact with almost completely with artifacts and almost never with natural items. So we have dramatically changed our lifestyle. I think of it like this. I always think of like what happens if we take a chimpanzee out of its natural wild environment and we put it into a Hilton and we make it live there and we make it eat the food there and we make it drink the coffee there and watch TV and sleep in those beds and sit in those chairs and hang out breathing that industrialized air that's come through these, recirculators, and it has to be in a climate-controlled environment. And how long would it take until we started to see degenerative disease in that animal? But that's kind of obvious. Yet we've been doing it now for generations and generations and generations. And essentially, we've disconnected from the power source. So just like if you leave your smartphone unplugged for a while and you keep using it, batteries run down, to plug it back in. The problem is most of us have forgotten how to plug back in. And not only did we forget, but our parents forgot, and their parents were in the process of forgetting, so nobody even told us there was a power source.
So what is that power source? I mean, you've got us on the edge of our seat now, right? For all of us who are feeling depleted and who are feeling like we're struggling just to keep up, what is it? You talk about nature, but okay, just walking in the woods. I mean, what are we talking about here? How do we reconnect with that power source?
Yeah, well, I would say that power source is multifaceted, but let's make it accessible to us. We'll start at the sun, which is that giant, hydrogen furnace that feeds energy to the dynamo of the earth, and those two celestial bodies together create a whole lot of different types of energy fields that we're fueled by. And more, I love the way science loves to negate these things. They'll act as if they don't exist until they independently discover it. Then it's a law, right? So if you had said in the past that there were subtle energy fields that our bodies were required to be in on the earth, I mean, that would have been considered foolish, or it would have been considered pagan, maybe, or something like that. But now we're discovering that these things are true, that we're affected by the magnetic fields, that we're affected by solar flares from the sun, that the subtle electrical body is affected by the electromagnetic body of the earth. So obviously there are forces beyond the sun as well. But let's start here. Our sun and our earth are really the source of that energy for us. First and foremost is getting sunlight. And I think it's really essential that we understand that all light is not the same. That light is this, we're talking about a spectrum. And on that spectrum are many forms of light, some visible, some invisible. But the sun puts out this visible spectrum of light, which we are seeing less and less of now, but we're designed to be bathed in every day. What's happening now is we have surrogate forms of light, and we think those lights are substitutes, but they're not. So our incandescent lights, our fluorescent lights, and I think what's really important to look at now are our computer monitors and our mobile phones and our tablet devices, which project their direct light sources. I think a good way to imagine this is if you went to the movie theater today and you watched a film, you would have a projector behind you that was a light source, and it would project that onto a screen, and you would see the reflected light, but you wouldn't be looking into the light source. That makes sense.
Yeah.
In the past, human beings had very few light sources they would look into. There was the sun, but you mostly don't look into the sun. You would only look at that at the rising or the setting, and then you might stare into flames, which are stored sunlight in objects. Today what happens is we're staring into a lot of light sources. Our phone, our computer, any of our mobile devices project light directly into our eye. Now that light feels really bright, doesn't it? Until you take it out at night into darkness, and you see that it's not very bright. Right? You might think that your phone feels very bright, but if you brought it out into total darkness at night, you'd see it barely illuminates anything. The light sources that we have are not as powerful as the sun, and their light frequencies, the spectrum of light that they put out, is not like the sun, but we're actually surrogating. So what's happening is we're taking in all these light from mobile devices and from computer devices, and we're not getting that light we need from the sun. So the first and foremost would be getting outside into the sun, and if you can, finding times of day where you can actually look at the sun. That's a really valuable thing. If you can actually look directly into the sun, to me that's like plugging your phone into the socket. If you can actually receive the light from the sun directly into your eyes, it feeds down your optic nerves and right directly into your nervous system. We can do that when the sun is rising and when the sun is setting, and otherwise just being out in that extremely bright sun. Of course, you guys have heard this. It regulates your serotonin and melatonin, and of course you guys know that it also causes the production in our skin of vitamin D, that very important master hormone. So really critical that we plug into the source, the sun.
Absolutely fantastic. Okay. And for those who feel a little bit skeptical about that, like I'm actually being charged by it, is there any kind of, you talked about, recently science has finally caught up to this and they're actually seeing that these electromagnetic fields have some real impact on us. Do you have any other kind of...
Well, I think it's interesting with the sun because more and more we see this evidence, particularly a lot of the evidence we're seeing is about vitamin D and about hormone regulation and about neurotransmitter regulation. But I think even if we just want to make it really simple, everybody knows this. How do you feel after a day in the sun? If you get a day out at the beach, if you get a day out, somewhere where you're getting sun exposure all day, you don't just feel good after, you feel like you're in an altered state after. I think that's really important to notice because you actually get into an altered state. You feel so much better when you're tan than when you're pale. And when we think about sick people, what do we picture? We picture pale and pasty. Yeah. When we picture healthy people, what do we picture? Tan. And what do you actually get? It's not just that you're tan, it's almost like a glowing. Why? Because we actually emit light. You know, people don't realize we emit light because we emit light in the invisible spectrum. We do emit some visible light. But think about this. Why after a marathon or somebody who's had hypothermia, why do they give them those space blankets to warm up? I mean, they're so thin. What's the purpose? It's a mirror. What does it do? It reflects the light, the infrared light that you emit back onto yourself. What happens when somebody charges up in the sun? They're almost glowing and shining afterward. So, I mean, I think, like, it's funny. I know that we would like to turn to scientific studies for this, but I think it's interesting, though, how quickly we'll bypass what we know to be true.
Look at empirical evidence. Look at your own experience. That's what you're saying.
Well, I think it's really important to, because the thing about empirical evidence is it gets used constantly to twist things. And it has been for a really long time, and it's fragmented. So the evidence we have, it's very difficult for the average person to put any of these studies into perspective, because they're like puzzle pieces. And it's very difficult because most people aren't scientific study builders. Most people don't do scientific literature reviews. So here's an example. You could look at a study on on a single herb, and you would get some information about that. But if you really wanted to understand that herb, you'd have to take all of the studies done on it and filter that all through your mind and do what's called a literature review. That's different, and that's not as easy for people. But the interesting thing is you could just take the herb and see what it does. I just think that's really interesting, because we do get so swayed by these things. I want to point out another piece as well, Elwin, which is that we can plug directly into the earth as well. And I know that a lot of people are beginning to understand this, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this idea of earthing and this barefooting revolution. Yeah. What we know now is that when you come in contact electrically with the ground, that might mean the actual ground outside, or that might mean any object that's grounded or has a direct electrical route to the ground. When you come in contact with that, not only do you discharge off static to the ground, you've all felt this when you've sort of walked on maybe a wool carpet and you touch someone and you discharge static to them, you get grounded for a second. But the other thing that happens is you pull electrons up from the ground into your body, a stream of electrons. What is that? Well, a stream of electrons is what we call electricity or current. So if we're talking about plugging yourself into an energy source, when you get grounded, you actually pull current, electricity, up from the ground. But more important, I think, is this understanding. Things that are positively charged, in other words, molecules that are missing electrons, are usually pretty toxic to us. Now, let me rephrase that. Things that are toxic to us are usually missing electrons. That's more fair to say. Okay. Things that are positively charged have lost electrons, and most of the things that are not healthy for us have lost their electrons. In other words, they've expired. They've lost their juice. Things that are really good for us can donate electrons to us. What's an antioxidant but a molecule that can donate electrons to our bodies? They have a charge intact and they can donate that to us. What are these negative ions that we get when we go to waterfalls or beaches or mountaintops? What are these ion generators people bring in their house? Well, they're electrically charged. They're negatively charged, or they contain an excess of electrons that they can donate. That's what a negative ion is, and that's why they're good for us. When we touch the earth itself, we start pulling in these free electrons, and those electrons are like master antioxidants. So they go throughout the body, helping to repair things, and they also really reduce inflammation. Inflammation is that linchpin of disease. Right? We would be hard-pressed to find a disease where we couldn't find inflammation implicated at the base of it. And we would be hard-pressed to find people with thriving energy who are really inflamed. Yes. And it'd be hard to find really inflamed people with very much energy. Yep. So what happens is when we actually touch the ground, we pull in free electricity, charge our bodies up, right? And you know what's interesting about this too, Elwin, is like, who's the burden of proof on, right? Because to say this, if every natural organism on the planet connects to the ground regularly, and every natural organism on the planet without man's interference seems to reproduce perfectly, and seems to have perfect health throughout its lifespan. And the only creature that's really deviated from this is one that's actually wearing a rubber insulator between its foot and the ground. And that's the only organism suffering from all this degenerative decay. who is the burden of proof on that grounding is good for you? Do we need to go, to say that and then have to back that up is so funny because really the burden of proof is on the sick people who refuse to do it. So, it's important to realize that your shoes are electrical insulators, and that I'm not saying you should never wear them, but I'm saying that you may want to, when you go outside, touch an object like a tree or a blade of grass or the ground itself to discharge some static and pull up some of that and electricity, and taking your shoes off. I think, one of the most powerful things that you can do on this planet for recharging yourself is to take your shoes off and watch a sunrise or sunset. I don't think there's much more than that. That's plugging your iPhone into the wall.
Fantastic. Would you say that those electrons, those free electrons, and something in the sun that we haven't quite quantified yet in any scientific ways are probably even more fundamental to energy than what's traditionally thought of as energy? Like people think of food, right, or ATP or glucose as kind of units of energy. Would you say electrons are like an equally valid way of measuring the energy?
Actually, they're the same. They're the proto form of that. So we can measure a lot of what's in the sun, right? We know that it's photonic energy, say. So let's say that we know any kind of long-chain carbon molecules is going to contain energy. What's food energy you're talking about? A fat, these long carbon chain molecules. They look like, like carbon-built, cartoon caterpillars almost, like carbon, 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 carbon. And between each bond of carbon is stored energy. Where'd that energy come from? Well, the sun. It's solar energy, right? Let's say that a wax like beeswax, the carbon in there contains energy. So when we burn it, it releases heat and light like a candle. What is that heat and light? Well, it's stored sunlight energy. That makes sense? That's what that is.
Absolutely.
When you burn a log, you're just seeing the light that was gathered in from the sun and stored. It's energy being re-released that was stored from the sun. So our food energy is sunlight energy that's been stored in carbon molecules. So all it is like these plants that we consume are like photovoltaic cells, just like it's solar power. They draw in and through the photosynthetic process, they take sunlight energy and trap it in carbon-based molecules. And we either eat that or we eat that further up the food chain or food web, but when we consume that, we are consuming sunlight energy. Of course, we can access some of that. Now, I'm not saying that we could go to that without the need for food. I think that we need multiple sources and forms of energy, but I think it's really obvious that the sun is emitting energy. You feel it. That's why it warms your skin. That's why if you looked into it, it would blind you. It's so funny, like, oh, the sun that's so new agey. The sun doesn't have any energy. Like, the sun is the energy source that powers the dynamo of the earth. So is there power looking in that? Absolutely. And again, it's those electrons that we were talking about before that are what make an antioxidant an antioxidant, what negatively charges molecules. So these things are in their more, when we get them from the earth and the sun, I guess you could say they're in their most rarefied form. And the further we go up that chain, that sequence into foods, say, the denser these things become and the more energy we have to expend to access them. So we get energy from food, but we expend energy to get that energy. And the goal is to have foods that give us a net energy, of course, because there's an expense there to get it. Whereas the energy we get from the sun is essentially a free energy, and the energy we get from the earth is essentially free. Now, my postulation would be this. You get a kind of, this is experiential, so this isn't something that, most of what I've been talking about today, we could just dig through a physics book, and this stuff would all become apparent very quickly. But here's my personal opinion based on experience would be that the energy from the ground, that electrical energy from the ground, and that photonic energy from the sun, power up the nervous system. They power up the brain and all of the central nervous system, and of course that filters out to the peripheral nervous system. Whereas food energy, of course, can fuel the nervous system, but primarily it fuels our physiological functions. It fuels our muscles, right? It puts that glucose, that ATP into the body, and gives us energy for work, but there's an energy that feeds the brain, feeds the endocrine system, and feeds the nervous system that I think comes from the ground and from the sun, or maybe more fair to say, can be harvested from those places.
That's an interesting distinction. Okay. And I guess that kind of aligns with a Taoist philosophy that we're both familiar with, at least that the earth would be nourishing our yin energy, which would then be feeding our nervous system and our brain, right? Mm. So that makes kind of sense on that traditional level as well, although again, that's not very scientific. A lot of people in the alternative health field, Daniel, talk about how a lot of health problems, including low energy, are kind of rooted in bad digestion, which is often rooted in people overeating or eating bad foods, which give them quick fixes of energy, but then leads to them having a crash. Would you say that part of the reason why we indulge in all that kind of thing in the first place then is just because we're not getting our source energy from that connection to nature that you're talking about? When we don't get enough from the sun and we don't get enough from the earth, that's where we start looking for all kinds of alternatives, and we start to overindulge in food because we think that's going to give us what we need because that's what we're taught, but it actually just leaves us feeling more and more depleted.
Yeah, it's like a self-perpetuating cycle, and part of this, I think what you're hinting at here is that there's a really serious addictive cycle. So people use foods the same way that pharmaceutical drug addicts use pharmaceutical drugs and street drug addicts use street drugs. And I'm, through conversations you and I have had, I think you know about me that I'm very open to pharmacologically active natural substances. So I'm very comfortable with that. But I do see that there's this heavy addictive cycle that people have with certain substances. Food's not, for me, I see food in the same way. But I think it's a difficult question. We've got to pull it apart back. If we go all the way back to the original natural humans living in a pristine state, the foods they consumed were very, very high in minerals and in vitamins. And not to mention whatever other subtle energies that we still are beginning to understand, are in our infancy of understanding that are in foods. I think it's very obvious to people that there's a kind of life force in foods, particularly when a food comes fresh out. Like if we went to your garden right now and we pulled a carrot out, there might still be some fresh carrots this time of year, and we pulled that out of the ground and we went to the store and we got one. I think it's obvious that there's kind of like a life force in one. I know that we don't know how to quantify that yet. But even if we did that, the carrot that we pulled out of your garden, as good as it would not really compare against the wild foods that were being consumed by our ancestors 10,000 years ago back to 200,000 years ago. So what's happening is, as we've moved on in our civilization, we love to tell the story like we've been climbing some kind of ladder, getting better and better, but what's actually been happening is the opposite. But as we've done that, our food values as far as nutrients and minerals are concerned have plummeted. But our calorie sources have continued to increase and increase and increase and increase. So what you have in a hunter-gatherer world are people who have very nutritious food, but have to constantly look for enough calories to fuel themselves. What you have today are people who have so many calories that they are overweight and inflamed from those calories, but no matter how much of them they eat, there's not enough nutrition. So in addition to being cut off from these really important electrical and electromagnetic energy sources that we've been talking about, in addition to that, they are eating food that's really high in stored energy, but not high in all of those substances that fuel our metabolic processes. So they're like starving while they're eating, and the more they eat, the bigger they get, and the more inflamed they get, and the more water they retain, and they're still not getting the energy they need from the sun or the earth. They're just taking in this food energy. Now what happens is they hit like a threshold where the body can't use all that food energy, because people just don't move the way we were designed to move. I mean, really, even I like to think about this, like even our really elite athletes are kind of sedentary by this, if compared against hunter-gatherer peoples.
Right.
These people live on the move, right? Sedentary doesn't just mean couch potato. Sedentary is the scientific term for people who stop hunting and gathering and therefore stay in one place. Hunter-gatherers are nomadic. Sedentary people live in a town or a city. So we're so sedentary that we don't use all this food energy. And what do we do with it? Well, then we store it in the bank account called body fat. So people accumulate all this body fat. Now it takes more energy just to move the body around. I mean, it's this endless cycle. And what's so funny about it is the approach of nutritionists, the approach of doctors, the approach of the whole modern paradigm is trying to treat each of these individual things. And it's like people miss the big picture, which is that the original plan for us, or the original design for us, or whatever we were originally adapted to, is what worked. That's the working model. And every departure from that creates more and more sickness, decay, disease, and lack of energy. And so the obvious thing is either go back to that, which I think would be really difficult to do now, or at least model our new lifestyle after that.
Okay.
So.
Well, that's really interesting. We'll get into what to do in a minute. I want to pick through the problem a little bit more, if that's okay. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about and get your perspective on is this issue of toxicity, you know, because like you, I like to hear from different angles, you know, rather than only listening to people who share what is already my viewpoint. And when I look at kind of conventional science, it tends to say that the whole issue of toxicity is completely made up. You know, there's so much natural toxicity, natural carcinogenics, natural heavy metals that we've been surrounded by throughout our evolution, and the amount is only increased by a tiny, tiny little bit. And I think that's probably the perspective that a lot of people have in the mainstream still, that, you know, people are like talking about toxicity, that they are freaking out about nothing, that they're paranoid, that they're conspiracy theorists. And I don't actually know your perspective on this, so I'm honestly asking you as well. How big an impact do you think that has on our energy?
Oh my God, it's tremendous. I think there's a subject, no doubt you've heard me talk about before in other conversations we've had, but this idea of the estrogen-testosterone balance that's happening today, right?
Right.
We know that testosterone and androgens are very much related to our energy levels, our willpower, and our drive. Our motivation comes from our androgens, or is heavily influenced by our androgens.
Can I just stop you there before we continue? And is that equally true for women, would you say?
Yes.
Yes,
correct.
Okay, just going to clarify.
Correct. And interestingly, there are toxins in our environment that are very new that mimic estrogen. And so they create an imbalance of estrogen to androgens. And of course, those things reduce our energy levels because our motivation, our will, and our drive goes down. And of course, you know, we're seeing headlines. I probably see a headline once a week. Just last week, it was French sperm counts down 50%. You know, we're seeing that all the time now. So that's just one example. Keep in mind that yes, our environment has always been full of toxins, particularly phytotoxins from plants and mycotoxins from fungi. Those have been around forever, but we have 200,000 years of adaptation to be around those. We also, one of the really unique things about, I guess this isn't actually totally unique to humans, but one of the amazing things about humans is that we have the intelligence to figure out how to detoxify these substances. For instance, there's a food that I eat here, a wild food called bracken fern, and it's got a cyanide compound in it. But I boil that plant in water, and what happens is the water turns purple and begins to smell like cherries.
Okay.
As it leaches out, that cherry smell is very related to cyanide. As it leaches out that cyanide, I can then remove the plant from that and eat that, and I get a lot of nutrition from that, and I leave behind the toxin, or enough of the toxin, if that makes sense. Our ancestors consumed earth compounds in clay to detoxify themselves. Clay has many free electrons, so it's electron negative, and it would bind to or adsorb electropositive toxins in our environment, and that would help to detoxify us. Our ancestors here on the North American continent utilized the sweat lodge as a means of sweating out toxic material. Now, here we are today in the most toxic environment that's ever existed. I mean, the idea that toxins are like some kind of conspiracy is really funny, right? Like, what about the radiological toxins from Fukushima and Chernobyl? Are these things not toxins? They cause cancer. We know that, right? So we have that. We have heavy metals that have always been present in the earth, but they were sparse and they were not concentrate. But we've refined them out and concentrated to them and then basically spewed them throughout our environment. So now we come in contact with mercury and lead and cadmium. So these things bioaccumulate in our body, and we know that these things interfere with our our normal physiology as well. So if there's another toxin, we know that most of these oil-based, these hydrocarbon substances that we're making, like plastics, are incredibly toxic to us, particularly when we're in our formative stages, like when we're in the womb still. These things, very small amounts of them, can dramatically affect the future, especially the sexual systems of a child. So we know that, right? And here's what we're not doing now. We're not doing that sweat lodge anymore. We're not doing the clay consumption anymore. We're not processing our food in a way to detoxify it anymore. These are things that our ancestors did up until really recently. I mean, there's another great case in point would be, it was understood up until very recently that if you were going to consume grains, you needed to soak those grains first to remove phytic acid. Phytic acid is an anti-nutrient. And what it does is it binds to B vitamins and keeps your body from being able to use them. So you, of course, would want to soak those in water to deactivate that phytic acid before you consumed it. Part of the reason people have such problems with grains today is because they don't process them properly. Well, that was understood. Now we don't do that. Now we simply grind them up and put them in food and feed ourselves anti-nutrients as a culture. This is insane. So I think a huge part of, here we are, we're recording this call 2 days between that 2012 solstice that's been talked about for so long, right? We've been talking about, as a culture, the big shift or this big new way of life or the end of the world, all these different things, right? To me, we are at a very critical moment, juncture in history where we need to decide. It's kind of like a suicidal person needing to decide, do I want to live? Right? We're like a culture that's been on a crash course with its own extinction, and we need to decide, do we want to live? Those of us who do, I know I do, those of us who are committed to living and committed to life, we need a whole bunch of strategies that replicate the life that we come from adaptively, and also we need strategies to deal with what we're going through in our environment, which is like all of this toxicity that we're talking about. We need strategies for that. So, that's one of the things I love to dream up is ways to mitigate these problems, because these chemicals are, it's not just like, I'll just avoid contact with toxic chemicals. Impossible. Totally impossible. It's not even, you couldn't, even if you were going to go live in a bubble, what's the bubble made of? Plastic? How are you going to avoid this stuff, right? Where are you going to go to avoid this stuff?
I think that's the challenge for a lot of people. They start reading about this quite often, and then they get completely overwhelmed. Like, oh my god, it's everywhere, I can't escape, and it's like some kind of horror film. And then they're like, okay, forget it. I'll just act as if it doesn't exist, and then they carry on. But it's still in the back of their mind, And so what we need is something that's actually realistic, right? Like you're saying, we're not going to pretend that the world is other than what it is, and yet we're not going to be incredibly fearful about it, because fear is going to be depleting of your energy as well, right?
Yeah, and then I want to bring in, fear is the mind killer. I want to bring in the quote from Dune. One other piece, which is the idea of hormesis, or what's called a hormetic effect.
Great.
And you can get more information about that on the internet, of course. But the idea of hormesis is that when you come in contact with very small amounts of a toxin, what constitutes a small amount of a toxin depends on the toxin, right? But when you come in contact with small amounts of a toxin or anything that stresses the physiology, there's generally a favorable adaptive response. So I think the classic example of this is exercise, which is a stress to the physiology, and it's damaging to the anatomy. So if we go and we work out very vigorously, I had a great workout this morning and yesterday, and I'm very sore from it. Why? Because I damaged muscle tissue. But what's the response to that? It's adaptive. So that next time I'm even more prepared for that same workout, if that makes sense. Yeah. Similarly, when we come in contact with toxins, our body has a adaptive reflex. Now, what we have to be careful about is getting too inundated with a toxin where we overload the ability to adapt to it. So why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing it up because the only solution right now to living in a world this toxic is becoming some kind of mutant that adapts to it. literally mutating and adapting to this world. Now, I think that's totally possible. I mean, that's what life is going to have to do. It's going to have to adapt to it. Probably not all species will be able to do that, but humans are one of the more adaptive species, which is bueno for us. But we're going to have to adapt to it. So that's one piece of it. And the second piece, I think, is taking a systems approach to detoxifying. So not a random approach or a hit and miss approach, but understanding how to utilize the way our body gets rid of toxins and then really maximizing that. I think that's really crucial. It's really simple, and it's not scary, and it doesn't take a bunch of time, and you don't have to be an expert, and you don't have to go to like, some kind of like 2-week, immersive, retreat at some kind of crunchy hippie place. You can do this stuff right at home. It's really easy. It's really accessible.
So just to clarify, most people, when they think detox or cleanse, they think about doing a cleanse for a certain period of time. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a lifestyle where we just take a few minutes of our day and we support our body in adapting to this world and we thrive, right?
Totally. We live the cleanse. That's just kind of you know what, here it's 2013 almost, you got to live the cleanse. That's just the reality. And those people who don't want to do that, I really love to support and motivate people, but I also love to be kind of real sometimes and just firm about it. Those people who don't do this they won't be represented in the gene pool in the future. That's it. Their lines are going, I mean, eventually, because what's happening now is that we're literally, we're losing 55% of human beings right now on this planet to cardiovascular disease, and we're losing 35% of people to cancer. These are two incredibly, as I know your research indicates the same, incredibly preventable issues, and things that almost were so statistically insignificant 100 years ago that they almost didn't exist, right? And now we're seeing them take over, and we know that cancer rate's about to jump to 50%. Okay, and here we are at 7 billion people. The people who figure out how to avoid that stuff are the ones who are going to re-people the earth as we move forward. Their genes will be represented. So setting up it's just kind of obvious, It's like, it's maybe not nice sounding, but the reality is that if you want to move your genetic material forward into the future, you're going to have strategies to stay clean inside. Otherwise, that toxic load is going to damage your body past the point of no return.
Fantastic. Okay, so enough teasing. Tell us, Daniel, how do we do it? What's the main steps for thriving in this 21st century world?
Well, I think it's a multifaceted thing, of course, right? So if there was just like some kind of thing that could come in a little package, I'd be selling that,
Well, of course.
I'd love to provide everything. But I think it's
people who are watching this, they are dedicated to mastery. They know that it's not a matter of taking a pill. They know that it's about, it's a long-term project, right? But what goal is ultimately more worth working towards than to survive and thrive and replicate, right? That's, as an animal, as a human, that's the thing that we're ultimately wired for. So people watching this right now, they're committed.
All right, cool. So let's make this as basic and easy to understand as possible. And in order to do that, we'll take some of the oldest concepts in the human psyche. So now we're going to move past even your neocortex. We're going like deep, deep, deep into your like reptilian brain, where there is old information stored. The most basic human information understanding about the world kind of goes like this. The whole universe is one, but it breaks into two. One is yin and one is yang. Together they make that whole, but if we separate them, we get a polarity. We could think of that polarity as the sun and the earth, right? That would be a really nice way to sort of say that yang masculine thing could be the sun, and that yin feminine thing could be the earth. Well, remember that if we take we want one whole approach, we split it into two, we need to get that sunlight and we need that connection with the earth, right? So we need that electrical principle from the earth and that photonic principle from the sun. Now that male thing breaks into two things. It breaks into fire and it breaks into air. And the female thing breaks into two more things, breaks into earth and breaks into water. So let's take these fundamental 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water, and let's think about what our body actually needs to thrive. Well, every day our body needs solid food that comes directly from the soil. So essentially, we need to consume the earth element, but we can't eat soil directly, so we eat things that grow out of the soil. But every day we need to consume earth. Every day we need to consume water, the element of water. Every day we consume air all day long via respiration. And every day we need fire, right? We need to be in the presence of enough light and warmth to stay healthy. Now, every day we also need to put those things back out. So every day you have to shit out earth. It has to come back out. And when it comes back out, it looks an awful lot like earth. I mean, it's compost. So you're like a soil maker, right? You put earth in and you shit soil back out. And every day you drink water, but you have to piss water back out of you. And every day you got to breathe that air in and you got to breathe that air back out of you. And every day you got to take that light in and you got to sweat out energy, excess heat energy, back out of you. So basically what we do is we move through reality, pulling the four elements in and emitting the four elements back out, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Now, since we eliminate all four elements, we need to look at what organs eliminate those four elements. So if we were going to look at how we get earth out of our body, well, it comes out of our colon, right? So the back sort of tailpipe of our digestive system. How do we get water out? Well, it comes via our renal system, which is essentially our kidneys to our bladder and out through our urethra. So that'd be like our kidneys. How we get the air out? Well, we get it out via the lungs. Mm-hmm. And how do we get that fire energy out? Well, we get it out through the skin. We sweat it, right? So we know that there's 4 ways out of the body. That's really important. If there's 4 ways out of the body, then we can start to create a strategic systems approach to getting things out of our body. If we've established that, geez, things get in our body that we want to get them out, well, okay, it helps to know, wait, there's only 4 ways things get out of the body. So how do we maximize that? Yeah. Well, so the first thing would be knowing that we need to make sure we're having complete and full bowel movements. And we need to understand that our liver dumps stuff into our intestine as well to help us get rid of stuff. So we need to maximize our liver detoxification. We can easily do that by regularly consuming herbs that help with that. For instance, just as we are having this conversation, I have to be drinking a dandelion root tea. And I know that that's going to cause my liver to secrete more bile. And that bile is going to end up in my large intestine. And the chia seed drink I had today is going to bind up a lot of that toxicity from there. And it's going to bulk up my bowel movement. It's going to give me a more reliable, regular bowel movement. I also love knowing how to give myself an enema. And I love knowing that if I need to, I know people who are colon hydrotherapists. If I really needed to maximize the removal of earth substances or solid substances from my digestive tract. So that's really helpful to know. It's also valuable to know that your liver is one of the mechanisms by which we get rid of these heavy metal and nuclear toxins. So the liver will take that stuff, put it in bile, put it into our bowel, and if we're eating a diet rich in good water-soluble fibers, like chia seeds or flax seeds, or if we're getting good fruits and berries into our diet, we can eliminate that stuff through the bowel. So the big thing is knowing we need to keep our bowel constantly eliminating.
And just for people who don't know, Daniel, what's the definition of constipation? Like for most people, once a day is perfect, right? So
yeah, well, I think once to 2 to 3 times a day makes a lot of sense. Anything less, I don't want to say 1 time a day isn't enough because I think there's a lot of different body types out there.
Okay.
But anything less than that, I would be looking at how I could get more regular. And I think, twice a day at least is kind of really what most people I know who live the lifestyle I live find themselves doing. That said, you can push that too far, and you don't want to. You need to be careful with your colon and your digestion because you have a lot of organisms living inside you, and you want to keep those organisms living inside you. That's a whole other conversation. But so we want to be careful utilizing things like enemas and utilizing things like colon hydrotherapy that we don't overdo it. And we want to be careful that we're not eating a diet that's causing us to just, be shitting liquid all day long where we're not getting enough nutrition. So we got to find that balance because that can happen on some of the diets out there.
I kind of thought once per meal was what I heard indigenous cultures do when that was checked. So I have 2 meals a day, and I find 2 times a day is perfect for me. But I appreciate what you're saying about different body types.
In different diets, right? Because the Inuit diet of all blubber and meat is going to look a lot, bowel movements are going to be different than in a place like the Amazon. So I just want to be careful about that. But I think that the average person's, Elwin, you probably have this experience. I love this. But I typically the only really public bathrooms I'm in are at the airport. AndLl be in the airport, and I love the sounds that come out of the stalls, It sounds like people are lifting weights, in order to go to the bathroom, right? Yeah. That's constipation. If your face is turning red and you're bursting blood vessels and you're threatening a stroke in order to have a bowel movement, it's time to soften things up a little bit. Okay, so but important to know that all the solid substances, they come out through the colon, so we need to maximize that channel of detoxification. Mm-hmm. The second one's going to be the kidneys, and that's all of our water-soluble wastes. Not just toxins, but wastes, things that aren't toxic necessarily, but we just don't need. Mm. So sometimes B vitamins, great example. If we get too many B vitamins, they're not toxic. We just don't need that many, so we'll pee them out. And then we also pee out toxic substances that are soluble in water. So remember, there are substances that are not particularly soluble in water. Great example would be all the heavy metals. They don't really come out in our pee. They're just not soluble enough in water. They're poorly soluble in water. But there are lots of toxic substances that are soluble in water, and they'll come out via the urine. So what we need to do is make sure that we're staying very hydrated. That's key. Water is a whole nother topic, but I really do believe a lot in fresh spring water or really high quality well waters, natural water sources if you have access to them. But regardless what water you're drinking, if your urine's starting to turn dark, if it's noticeably golden, it's time to start diluting yourself a little bit more, right? So that you're peeing. Now, it might look clear going into your toilet, but that's because you're peeing into a water body and it's diluting your urine. So if you peed even very hydrated into a glass, there's going to be some straw coloration, and that's normal. But we don't want our urine starting to look like orange juice. That's where we're really backing the system up. And we want to keep ourselves... I like to use diuretic herbs, so herbs that help to, and you're going to find that most of the herbs out there have a diuretic property. So using herbalism helps us to keep a good solid urine out, I guess not good solid, good liquid urine output, so that we're constantly eliminating our water-soluble toxins. Next one's going to be through our respiratory system, through our expiration. That's the way we get rid of gaseous toxins. So a great example that we all are aware of is carbon dioxide, which is a metabolic byproduct for our bodies. It's like the exhaust from a car. For our cells, their metabolic byproduct, one of them is carbon dioxide. Remember that we're burning carbon-based molecules in order to get energy. And so what we're left with after we harvest that energy out is carbon. We got to get rid of it. So we turn it into carbonic acid, and then we exhale it as carbon dioxide. But we get rid of other gases as well. If you're living in a very urban environment, you're breathing lots of gaseous toxins. And so you need to get those out. I think the best way to do that, in addition to learning to breathe more naturally and more deeply, that's going to be a big one for a lot of people. If they haven't explored that, I want to point this out, Elwin, I think you're on a similar path to me with this. I don't think you need to, go do a 6-year course in breathing. I think you need to do the meta learning program, which is you immerse yourself in information for a couple of days, and then you got it, and you don't need to really revisit it because you're now doing it. So take a couple days to figure this out. If you're breathing primarily into your chest, which is real common in the world today, then you're basically stuck in a perpetual fight or flight response. And the idea is of moving that breath down a little bit so that the diaphragm can relax. Sometimes they call it belly breathing, but really what it is diaphragmatic breathing. So that's going to be ventilating us better so that we're going to be getting more air in and we're going to be getting more air back out. Another thing that I love to do is an exercise called the vacuum, where you essentially breathe out all your air as fully as you can, and then you pull in the abdomen. That just wrings out the lower lung fields. So I think if people picture their lungs to be like two sponges, like two sink sponges, usually what people are doing is they're breathing in that upper third of the of the sponge, and the lower 2/3 is still full of like all the grimy gunk that's not getting pressed out. So you could picture if I took a sponge that had real dirty water and I sort of gave it a half squeeze, when I was done, there'd still be all kinds of dirty water in there. I need to give it a full squeeze to really get all that out. Well, if you give your lungs a full squeeze once a day, what you do is you exhale all the trapped gases in the lower lung fields. So that's really smart. And then getting yourself, whenever you can, into places with fresh air. So that might be a local hike that you know, a local walk that you know, a local waterfall, a local beach, a local mountaintop that you go to. It might be just getting yourself a good ionizer or ozone producing machine for your house or something like that, where you're getting good electrically charged air, that you're breathing that in and you're exhaling out toxic material. It might also mean keeping your windows open a little bit more, your doors open a little bit more, and being very conscientious about what you bring in your home. Because the things we bring in our home these days are often outgassing volatile organic compounds. So we need to be thoughtful about this, because the new carpet, the new couch, the new countertop, what are these things made of, and what are they outgassing, and for how long are they outgassing? So we need to be careful of that. You go into a new building today, which is so efficiently sealed for basically keeping heat and cooling in, and then it's completely filled up with toxic outgassing products. What you're walking into is basically a gas chamber, so you need to be thoughtful about that. The last one, and for me, one of the most interesting, is our integumentary system, or our skin system, which is how we eliminate all of that thermal energy, that fire energy. What's fascinating about the skin, you've heard this, the skin is the third kidney. Sometimes I tell people, though, that the skin is the second liver, because it's both. It's both. This is really neat. Remember I said the kidneys eliminate water-soluble toxins. Well, hey, we sweat water out, so great. The skin's like a third kidney. But we also sweat out oil. So our sweat is both water and oil, and so that really helps us to understand that our skin has the functionality of both the renal or kidney system and of like the digestive system, which is where we eliminate via the liver into the colon, where we eliminate oils. Well, the skin can do both. So when we go into the sauna or we go into the sweat lodge, what happens is oil's coming out of our body, and that oil can carry those oil-soluble toxins. So those radiological toxins that we're all more and more aware of now. The United States had another nuclear test just recently, by the way. We can sweat those things out. We can sweat out those heavy metals. In addition to that, we can sweat out those water-soluble toxins like urea, for instance, which can come out the skin as well. So our skin can do both jobs. The caveat to this is that the skin eliminates best when we are in a relaxed state, not when we're in an excited state. Because what happens when we are running or where we're doing cardiovascular exercise, we are sweating, but our detoxification pathways are essentially shut down at that time because we are in a sympathetic nervous system response. So exercise is great. I'm in no way discouraging it. I just want to point out that it's not much of a detoxifier, because when we're running, our parasympathetic nervous system, which controls our detoxification pathways, goes to sleep, and our sympathetic or fight or flight kind of nervous system comes to the forefront. But when we go into a sauna, what happens is we sit calmly, and actually it activates that heat and warmth. You guys have all felt this when you get super warm, you get into that relaxed kind of almost drowsy high state. What that is your sympathetic nervous system shutting down, and your parasympathetic nervous system comes to the forefront. That opens the detoxification pathways, and we start eliminating through the skin. So sauna is a very effective way to do that. And I like to tell people, for those of us who aren't particularly avid meditators, what's nice is that you get a lot of the benefits of meditation in a sauna, because a lot of the benefits are that you bring the parasympathetic nervous system to the forefront.
I love the sauna. It's something I do maybe 3 to 5 times a week, like a lot. And I always notice my best ideas come there as well. I'll be like working hard all day trying to do stuff. I go to go to exercise, go to the sauna, chill out, and then all that clarity, everything I've been struggling with, everything just, all the stress fades away, and then I'm just left with clarity, and whatever it was that I was struggling to get, I've just got. And I was going to say that's one of the things I love about the sun as well the most, is that, especially, if you're actually able to be out in the hot sun, is it's so relaxing to the body, right? And so that's the other thing. It's relaxing you, and then it's allowing you to detoxify. So I guess that's another benefit of being in the sun.
Yeah, fantastic. And so I think when we combine all these things together, get your naked body, as much as possible of your naked body, into the sun.
Hmm.
Get your some bare skin in contact with the ground, and then just make sure you keep aware of all four elements: what's going in, what food's going in, what water's going in, what air's going in, what light's going in, and what's coming back out, and those four channels as well. So how are you shitting, pissing, exhaling, and sweating? If you keep those six pieces in balance, they're all like little plates that you're spinning, just make sure they all keep spinning. Don't let any one of them go stagnant. Just keep them all rolling. I think you got a really solid strategy to move into this new world, this new exciting kind of world we're in. And I think what happens is a lot of other health approaches, they'll hit a few of those things, but maybe not all of them. Or some of the really good ones will hit all of them, but maybe don't necessarily identify with them very easily. And what's really helpful is this, what I'm calling a systems approach here, where when you understand what it is that you're trying to do, then you can infinitely create new strategies to do it. So I just shared some of my strategies, but you might come up with totally different ones based on the same principles. I mean, the principles are pretty core and fundamental. I also just think it's interesting. I know that you're into, last time we talked a bit about neuroplasticity in the brain, and I just think it's interesting, the idea that you have those thoughts in the sauna. I'm not clear what brainwave states come forward in the sauna, but I do know that it's a parasympathetic nervous thing, so it's a lot like meditating. So you would think that you get into a brainwave state in the sauna that's very similar to, coming into like a Zen kind of a place. And so, of course, it allows these thoughts to come to the surface. That's really beautiful.
Yeah, I think maybe high alpha waves, as I understand it, is that sudden like presence, and then with presence comes that clarity, right?
That's really cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, Daniel. That's like, in a nutshell, basically absolutely everything that a person really needs for a high energy life. And you may be shocked if you read the book at some point, just how similar what you just laid out is to what I'm laying out too. So I should actually just tell you, I promise I didn't steal it all from you, although you certainly be
awesome.
an inspiration.
We're all here to share this similar message. I mean, that's the goal, right?
And the truth is the truth, and I think that's the interesting thing for anyone watching. It's not like Daniel and I have conspired here to tell you exactly the same thing. It's like we've just discovered it independently, generally from our own volition, that this is basically how things work, right? And if you're interested in having a high level of energy, if you're interested in having a high level of consciousness, which I know a lot of you are as well, because like Daniel said, maybe food can get you through the day, but in order to have a high level of consciousness and a high degree of connection to the world around you and a high level of awareness, you need to be feeding yourself with these other forms of energy, like the sun and like the earth, which I thought was a really interesting distinction, actually, Daniel. I haven't heard it before. You said it's your own personal perspective, but I think that's absolutely spot on. So thank you for sharing everything that you have. It's been fantastic, and I love hearing your perspective, and I love hearing you've obviously looked into this in a lot of depth, but more importantly, you're obviously a living, breathing, practicing example of someone who does this every day, and so it's really great to hear it from you.
Oh, great. Hey, I'm looking forward to connecting with you again in the future. Thanks for giving me the time today.
Thanks so much. And for anyone who is interested in your perspective, which I'm sure everyone must be by now having watched this, where do they find you?
You can find me at danielvitalis.com, and through there they can find my company, surthrival.com, or my springwater project, findaspring.com, and they can also find plenty of my stuff on YouTube as well.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing with us, and everyone out there, remember, this is all amazing, but it's not theory. It's time to put it into practice. So if there's just even one or two things that you've heard today that you're like, that's really interesting, or that really rings true for me, don't let it be just interesting. Let it be something that you take action on, that you implement, and that you actually test. Ultimately, Daniel and I don't really want your agreement or your disagreement. We want your action, which leads to results, and then we want to hear about it. Yeah. I hope you agree with that, Daniel, speaking for you.
I do, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.